Keanu Reeves stepped into the Lumiere restaurant, his presence quiet yet unmistakable. Dressed in a simple black jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots, he looked out of place among the lavish decor. The chandeliers shimmered above tables draped in fine linen, where well-dressed patrons sipped expensive wine and exchanged hushed conversations. The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a statement of status, a sanctuary for the elite. As Keanu took a step forward, the soft murmur of conversation seemed to falter. Eyes flickered toward him, subtle but unmistakable. Who was this man, dressed so plainly, daring to walk into one of the most exclusive establishments in the city? Behind the front desk, Amanda, the hostess, straightened her posture. Her sharp gaze scanned him from head to toe, her expression tightening. To her, he was just another nobody who had wandered in from the streets. With a practiced smile, one that barely concealed her condescension, she stepped forward. "Sir, I think you might be looking for a different place," she said, her voice laced with polite dismissal. Keanu met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "No, I'm exactly where I want to be," he replied calmly. Amanda's smile thinned. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight, reservations only." A few guests nearby watched with quiet amusement. A couple in designer outfits exchanged knowing smirks. A man in a tailored suit whispered something to his companion, both shaking their heads. Keanu remained unfazed. "That's fine," he said simply, nodding before turning toward the exit. Amanda exhaled in relief, already moving on, until a sudden voice cut through the air. "Amanda, what have you done?" The voice came from across the room, urgent and filled with disbelief. A man in a tailored navy suit strode toward them, his face pale with shock. Amanda turned, startled. "Mr. Daniels?" The owner of Lumiere didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the man she had just dismissed. "You just turned away Keanu Reeves." Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The name Lumiere wasn't just synonymous with luxury, it was a landmark of exclusivity. Nestled in the heart of Los Angeles, the restaurant was a symbol of status, a place where the rich and powerful gathered under golden chandeliers, sipping aged wine and discussing million-dollar deals over handcrafted dishes. Getting a reservation wasn't just about making a call, it was about who you were. The waiting list stretched for months, and even celebrities weren't always guaranteed a table. The guests here weren't just looking for a meal, they were looking for validation, a way to showcase their success to the world. Keanu Reeves, however, wasn't here for the luxury. He wasn't here for the exclusivity. He was here for something far more personal. Years ago, long before Hollywood knew his name, before The Matrix, John Wick, or even his early indie films, Keanu had once worked in this very restaurant. But back then, it was a very different place. Lumiere hadn't always been a sanctuary for the elite. In the late 80s, it was a humble, struggling bistro tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. There were no velvet ropes, no dress codes, no pretentious rules. The tables were simple wooden ones covered with cloth napkins that had seen better days. The lighting was warm and slightly dim, and the air always carried the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and garlic butter. But it wasn't perfect, but it had heart. Keanu had been just another young dreamer in Los Angeles at the time, taking whatever jobs he could find to support himself while going to auditions. Lumiere had been one of those jobs. He started as a busboy, scraping plates, wiping tables, stacking chairs at the end of the night. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to cover rent and gas money, and for a struggling actor, that was all that mattered. More than anything, though, he remembered the people. There was Miguel, the head chef, who never failed to sneak him an extra bread roll at the end of his shift. There was Anna, the elderly waitress who had worked there for decades, who always had a kind word for the staff, no matter how chaotic the evening got. And then there was Mr. Lancaster, the owner, an older gentleman with a love for food and an even bigger love for people. "It's not about what they wear, kid," Lancaster had once told him, wiping down the counter after a long night. "It's about how they treat others. That's the only thing that matters." Keanu had never forgotten those words. But time had a way of changing things. After Lancaster retired, the restaurant was sold to new owners, and little by little, it lost its soul. The rustic wooden tables were replaced with polished marble. The handwritten menus, once filled with the chef's personal recommendations, became sleek, corporate-designed booklets. The warm, inviting glow of the bistro was traded for an atmosphere of cold perfection, where every detail was meticulously designed to impress. At first, the changes seemed small: a new wine list, a higher price point, a new clientele. But before long, Lumiere was no longer the cozy neighborhood spot Keanu had once known. It had become something entirely different. It had become exclusive. And then, as if it were some kind of twisted irony, the restaurant that had been redesigned for the wealthy began to struggle under its own weight. The new owners had expanded too quickly, invested too much, and within a few years, Lumiere was on the verge of bankruptcy. That was when an anonymous investor had stepped in, saving the restaurant from closure with an enormous financial bailout. That investor had been Keanu. He had done it quietly, without ever revealing his identity. He didn't want credit, he didn't want gratitude, he only wanted to see the place survive, to keep a part of its old soul intact. He had hoped that, despite all the changes, Lumiere could still be a place of warmth, of kindness, of people who cared. But now, standing in its grand entrance years later, Keanu could see just how wrong he had been. There was no warmth here anymore. The air carried an unspoken arrogance, an invisible wall between the staff and the guests. Instead of friendly conversations, there were whispered judgments. Instead of the smell of homemade cooking, there was an artificial perfection, curated to please the elite. And worst of all, instead of the welcoming atmosphere he once knew, there was this. A young hostess looking at him with thinly veiled disdain, a restaurant full of guests who barely spared him a glance except to wonder why someone dressed like that had dared to walk in. Keanu hadn't come here tonight expecting anything special. He hadn't come to be recognized. He hadn't come to be treated differently. He had simply wanted to sit, to eat, to remember. But instead, he had been met with judgment. And that perhaps was the most disappointing part of all. A heavy silence hung in the air. Amanda's face paled as the realization struck her like a thunderbolt. Her breath caught in her throat and her fingers instinctively clutched the edge of the podium. "You just turned away, Keanu Reeves." The words from Mr. Daniels, the owner of Lumiere, rang through the room like a gunshot. A few guests turned their heads in surprise, some raising their eyebrows, others suddenly realizing why the man in the simple black jacket had seemed familiar. A hushed murmur spread across the restaurant as people started whispering among themselves. Amanda's stomach twisted into a tight knot. Keanu Reeves?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced. The name echoed in her head, clashing violently against the assumptions she had made just moments ago. No, it couldn't be. This couldn't be the same Keanu Reeves. Not the Hollywood icon, not the man worth millions, not the star of some of the biggest movies in the world. She swallowed hard and slowly turned her head, her gaze landing on Keanu, who stood near the entrance, his expression as calm as ever. He hadn't reacted to the sudden revelation, hadn't made any attempt to bask in the shock now rippling through the restaurant. If anything, he seemed unbothered. But the rest of the room wasn't. A well-dressed couple seated near the entrance exchanged guilty glances. The man in the tailored navy suit who had whispered to his companion earlier now looked visibly uncomfortable. Even the bartender, who had been polishing glasses absent-mindedly, had frozen mid-matra, his eyes locked onto Keanu. Amanda's throat went dry. She had humiliated Keanu Reeves, the man whose name alone commanded admiration worldwide. The actor known not just for his films, but for his kindness, his humility, his generosity. The real-life good guy. And she had treated him like a nobody. "Sir, I didn't know," she began. But Mr. Daniels cut her off with a sharp glare. "Save it," he snapped, before turning to Keanu with an expression that was equal parts panic and regret. "Mr. Reeves, please, this is an awful mistake. Allow me to personally welcome you. We'd be honored to have you dine with us tonight. On the house, of course." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if considering the offer. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. If anything, he looked almost amused by the scene unfolding before him. "That's kind of you," he said in his usual gentle tone, "but I wouldn't want to take a seat that belongs to someone more elite." His words were soft, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Amanda felt the sting of them like a slap. Daniels flinched. Around the restaurant, the whispers grew louder. A few guests exchanged nervous glances. Others stared down at their plates, suddenly ashamed of the way they had reacted earlier. Amanda's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. "Mame, Reeves, please," she tried again, this time her voice trembling. "I didn't mean..." But Keanu only gave her the same calm, unreadable look he had when she first dismissed him. "I know," he said simply. The words hung in the air. Simple, devastating. Amanda's chest tightened. She had seen many guests come and go, many people who flaunted their wealth, their power, but no one had made her feel this small without even raising their voice. She wanted to disappear. But before she could say anything else, Mr. Daniels turned on her, his voice sharp and cold. "You're fired." Amanda's breath hitched. "What?" she gasped, her wide eyes darting between him and Keanu. "You heard me," Daniels snapped. "Lumiere does not tolerate this kind of treatment toward any guest, let alone someone like Mr. Reeves. Gather your things and leave. Now." The entire restaurant fell into complete silence. Amanda opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Her world had just shattered in an instant. She turned to Keanu, hoping, praying that he would intervene, that he would say something, anything to stop this. But Keanu only watched her quietly, waiting to see what she would do next. Amanda's breath came in short, uneven gasps. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat an echo of panic and regret. This wasn't just a reprimand. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment she could brush off by the end of her shift. This was her career unraveling in real time, in front of an audience. She had spent years working her way up, starting as a hostess in small restaurants, then climbing to a position at Lumiere, a place she had once considered the pinnacle of success. She had studied the way the elite behaved, learned the art of distinguishing between those who belonged and those who didn't. It was never explicitly taught, but it was there, ingrained in every glance, every carefully measured interaction. And now, in mere seconds, it was all slipping away. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the podium for support. She wanted to protest, to explain herself, to do something. But what could she possibly say? She had done exactly what Daniels accused her of. She had judged Keanu, dismissed him, humiliated him, all because of his appearance, and now she was paying the price. A hush had fallen over the restaurant. All eyes were on her, but no one spoke. The same guests who had chuckled moments ago, the same ones who had silently approved of her behavior, now watched in uncomfortable silence, as if realizing their own complicity. Amanda's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, But before she could finish, Keanu finally moved. Not toward her, but toward Daniels. "That won't be necessary," he said calmly. Daniels blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Keanu turned slightly, nodding toward Amanda, who now looked as though she might collapse under the weight of her humiliation. "Firing her won't change what happened," he said. "And it won't change what's wrong with this place." Daniels stiffened. He was about to protest, but hesitated. There was something in Keanu's voice. Not anger, not accusation, but a quiet certainty that made it impossible to argue. Keanu wasn't just talking about Amanda. He was talking about everything: the unspoken hierarchy, the culture of exclusion, the way the staff was trained to prioritize wealth over kindness. A few guests shifted in their seats, suddenly hyper-aware of their own actions. Amanda's breath hitched as she stared at him. He wasn't defending her, not exactly. He wasn't saying she had done the right thing, but he was giving her a chance, one she wasn't sure she deserved. She started, struggling to find the right words. "I judged you. I was wrong." Keanu studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, you were." Amanda swallowed hard. She felt exposed, raw, like the ground had been ripped from beneath her. But for the first time, she realized this wasn't just about her. She wasn't the first person to treat a guest this way. She had seen it happen before. She had done it before. Maybe not always with the same blatant condescension, but the mindset had always been there. Was she really sorry for what she had done to him? Or was she sorry because she had been caught? She felt the shame settle deep into her chest. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "But I'll do better. I swear I will." Keanu held her gaze for a moment longer, then offered the smallest of nods. "I hope so," he said simply. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't an easy way out, but it was something. Daniels cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. He needed to regain control of the situation, to shift the attention away from the awkward reality of what had just transpired. "Mrs. please, at least allow me to offer you a private dining experience. No charge, of course." Keanu cut him off with a small, amused shake of his head. "Appreciate the offer, but I'll pay for my meal like anyone else." Daniels hesitated, then nodded quickly, eager to salvage the moment. Of course, please, allow me to personally escort you to the best table." Keanu turned, his eyes scanning the restaurant. He saw the guests still staring, the lingering awkwardness thick in the air. Then he looked at Amanda, who stood motionless, as if afraid that any movement might shatter what little dignity she had left. "Actually," he said, turning back to her, "why don't you recommend something?" Amanda's eyes widened. "Me?" she croaked. "Yeah," Keanu said with a small smile. "Bring me whatever you'd recommend for a friend." Amanda swallowed hard, nodding. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even a second chance, but it was trust, and she wasn't going to waste it. The tension in the restaurant hadn't completely faded. It lingered in the air, thick and heavy, like the final notes of a song that no one knew how to follow. Conversations had resumed, but they were hushed, cautious, filled with forced normalcy. Silverware clinked against fine china. Waiters moved between tables with rehearsed grace. But everyone's attention remained, subtly, on one person: Keanu Reeves. He moved through Lumiere with the same unshaken calm he had walked in with, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The atmosphere, the energy, the way people looked at him, the way people looked at themselves. At first they had dismissed him. Now they watched him with quiet reverence, some with admiration, others with guilt. It was clear now, they had judged too quickly, assumed too much. Amanda felt it too. As she hurried toward the kitchen, she felt the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. She had spent months, years even, perfecting the art of catering to the elite. She knew which wines to suggest to billionaires, which dishes to recommend to celebrities, which small gestures made people feel important. But never before had she been asked to serve a friend. Keanu's words echoed in her mind. "Bring me whatever you'd recommend for a friend." It was such a simple request, and yet she realized with a jolt, she had no idea what to do. Had she ever treated a guest here like a friend? Had she ever truly considered what someone might want instead of what she thought they should have? The thought unsettled her. She stepped into the bustling kitchen, the air thick with the scent of butter, herbs, and seared meats. The staff inside was buzzing with activity, but the moment they saw her, a ripple of awareness passed through them. They knew. News traveled fast in a place like Lumiere. The girl who had just insulted Keanu Reeves was now responsible for serving him. Some cooks exchanged knowing glances, others smirked. The sous chef, a man named Marco, raised an eyebrow at her as he chopped fresh parsley. "What do you need?" he asked, not looking up. Amanda hesitated, suddenly feeling like she was standing on the edge of something bigger than just a menu choice. "I need a meal for table 12, she said carefully. Marco barely reacted. "What's the order?" Another pause. And then, for the first time in her career, Amanda let go of the idea of status. "Make the kind of dish you'd cook for someone you care about." The words felt foreign in her mouth, unfamiliar yet strangely liberating. Marco's knife paused mid-chop. He finally looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Excuse me?" "Something real," she said, firmer now. "Not what's most expensive, not what's meant to impress, just something good." For a moment there was silence. Then Marco smirked. About time someone asked for that. Without another word, he turned and began working, calling out quick instructions to the other chefs. Pans clattered, flames flared, and within moments the kitchen had shifted gears, not to prepare a $200 plate of truffle-infused wagyu, but to create something real. Amanda exhaled, feeling a strange weight lift from her shoulders. Meanwhile, in the dining area, Keanu settled into his seat. Daniels had, of course, offered him the most exclusive table in the restaurant, a private, tucked-away spot in the back, meant for high-profile guests, the kind of table where celebrities could hide behind velvet curtains and dine in solitude, but Keanu had declined. Instead, he chose a simple table near the center of the restaurant, right in the middle of everyone. If he had wanted privacy, he could have taken it. If he had wanted to be treated like a star, he would have allowed it. But Keanu wasn't interested in exclusivity. He didn't care about being placed in a corner where people would whisper his name in hushed tones. He wanted to be with people. And people were watching. Some guests tried to act indifferent, but their eyes betrayed them, flickering toward him every few seconds. Others were more obvious, whispering to their dining companions, nudging each other, eyes widening as if realizing, he's really here. He's really staying. A well-dressed woman near the bar, who had earlier scoffed at his presence, now looked down at her half-empty glass of champagne, her expression unreadable. A man who had smirked when Amanda dismissed him now kept his eyes firmly on his plate, as if ashamed of his own reaction. Even Daniels, who stood nearby, didn't quite know what to do with himself. He was eager to salvage the situation, to make things right, to offer Keanu anything that might smooth over the embarrassment his restaurant had just suffered, but deep down, he knew that trying to impress Keanu Reeves was a lost cause. Keanu didn't need to be pampered. He just needed to be treated like a person. Amanda emerged from the kitchen moments later, carefully balancing a tray in her hands. On the plate sat a steaming dish. Not something extravagant, not something flashy, but something that smelled real. Something comforting. It was a rustic pasta dish, freshly made, topped with fragrant herbs and a rich, homemade sauce. The kind of meal that wasn't about luxury, but about warmth. Amanda hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. She placed the dish in front of Keanu, her hands steady even though her pulse was racing. "I hope you like it," she said softly. Keanu looked up at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he smiled. "I'm sure I will." And with that, he picked up his fork and took the first bite. Amanda exhaled, and for the first time since the night had begun, she felt like she had finally done something right. As Keanu took his first bite, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The soft clinking of silverware against plates grew faint. Conversations dulled into a background murmur as eyes flickered toward the man seated at the simple table in the center of Lumiere. Amanda, standing just a few feet away, felt an odd mix of nervousness and anticipation. It was absurd this was just food, a plate of pasta, nothing more. And yet, it felt like the most important moment of her entire career. Keanu chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a man who exaggerated his emotions, who performed reactions for attention. He took his time, savoring each bite, as if the world wasn't waiting for his verdict. Amanda could feel the weight of every second. Daniels, standing stiffly nearby, cleared his throat. He, too, was waiting for a lifeline, for something to grasp onto that might redeem the disastrous events of the evening. Finally, Keanu set down his fork. A small, satisfied smile crossed his face. He nodded slightly, then looked up at Amanda. "He's as good." 3 simple words. But the effect was instant. The tension in Amanda's chest unraveled like a loosened knot. She let out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. "I'm glad," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Keanu took another bite, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced around the room, noting the lingering stares from guests who had once dismissed him, but now observed him with a quiet, almost awkward curiosity. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't basking in their discomfort. If anything, he seemed amused. He set his fork down again, gesturing lightly toward his plate. "You should put this on the menu," he said casually, looking at Amanda. Amanda blinked. "What?" "Dish," Keanu continued, twirling a bit of pasta around his fork. "It belongs here." Amanda hesitated, glancing at Daniels, who had stiffened at the suggestion. Daniels quickly recovered, his business instincts kicking in. Yes, of course, we could add it as a special. Maybe name it after you, the Keanu special? Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. No need for that. Just a dish that makes people feel welcome. His words settled over the restaurant like a quiet revelation. Amanda looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she understood. This wasn't just about food. This was about what Lumiere had lost. She thought back to the way she had treated him, the way she had instinctively judged him the second he had walked through the door. And not just him, countless others before him, people she had deemed unworthy of this space, simply because they didn't fit a certain image. But the truth was, Lumiere had once been a place that welcomed people, that made them feel comfortable, not judged, and somewhere along the way, in the pursuit of exclusivity, it had forgotten its soul. Amanda straightened. I think that's exactly what this place needed, she said softly. Keanu smiled, but said nothing more. He simply resumed his meal, as if this were any other night, as if the entire restaurant weren't still reeling from the quiet transformation unfolding in front of them. Amanda turned and made her way toward the kitchen, her mind racing. The menu would change, the culture would change, and so would she. The atmosphere in Lumiere had softened. It wasn't something dramatic, not a sudden, obvious shift, but rather a quiet unraveling of tension. The air, once thick with judgment and exclusivity, now carried something else: introspection. The hushed whispers that had once been filled with amusement and superiority had taken on a different tone. The very same guests who had smirked when Keanu first walked in now seemed oddly subdued. A businessman in an expensive suit stole glances at him, stirring his wine without taking a sip. A woman in a designer dress, who had once eyed Keanu with barely hidden disdain, now looked down at her untouched plate, deep in thought. It was as if everyone had been confronted with something they hadn't expected, a mirror held up to their own behavior. And in the center of it all, completely unbothered, Keanu Reeves sat at his simple table, enjoying his meal. Amanda stood near the service station, watching him. She should have moved on by now. There were other tables to check, other guests to assist. But something about the moment held her in place. She had spent years perfecting the art of catering to the elite. She had been trained to recognize the kind of people who belonged here, who deserved to be here. And without realizing it, she had become part of a system that judged people by their clothes, their posture, their status. But tonight had shaken that foundation. Keanu hadn't demanded respect. He hadn't raised his voice or insisted on being treated differently. He had simply been himself. And somehow, that had been enough to make an entire room of people, including herself, reconsider everything. For the first time since she had started working at Lumiere, Amanda questioned what this place had become. Was it truly about fine dining? About creating a memorable experience? Or had it turned into something else, something colder, something artificial? Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and approached Keanu's table once more. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Keanu looked up at her, considering the question for a moment. Then, with an easy smile, he shook his head. "No, I'm good. This was perfect." Amanda hesitated. She knew she could walk away now, return to work, let the night continue as if nothing had happened. But something inside her needed to say more. She started, then paused, exhaling softly. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused. "For what?" She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "For reminding me what really matters. I think I forgot along the way." Keanu studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he gave a small nod of understanding. "Happens to the best of us," he said simply. That was it. No long speech, no lecture, just a quiet acknowledgement that people could change if they wanted to. Amanda straightened, offering a small smile before turning back toward the kitchen. She wasn't sure what would happen tomorrow, or next week, or next month. But she did know one thing. She would never look at a guest the same way again. And neither would Lumiere. At the front of the restaurant, another hostess greeted a new guest. The woman looked slightly out of place, dressed in a plain cardigan instead of designer labels. But this time, instead of a forced smile, the hostess welcomed her with genuine warmth. Perhaps, without realizing it, the entire restaurant had learned something tonight. And in the center of it all, Keanu Reeves finished his meal, completely unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of the quiet revolution he had just started. The night at Lumiere became more than just an evening. It became a story. By the next morning, whispers had turned into headlines. Someone had recorded the moment Keanu was turned away, and within hours, social media was flooded with posts. Keanu Reeves humbly enters an elite restaurant, gets rejected, then changes everything. The video went viral. Thousands of people commented, not just about Keanu's humility, but about deeper lesson hidden in the moment. Amanda saw the headlines too. She read the comments, the debates, the overwhelming praise for Keanu's kindness. And yet, what stayed with her most wasn't the viral fame. It was the quiet realization that she had been given a second chance. A week later, Lumiere introduced a new menu item. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't pretentious. It was simply called the welcome dish. And for the first time in years, Lumiere wasn't just a place for the elite. It was a place for everyone.